we're in a clickbait world and everybody is trying to, figure out how to gather attention, look at the news cycle. It's everywhere around us. And so it makes perfect sense that people would feel that way. Also, if anybody has had that real life experience, I can imagine how hard it would be to imagine their experience being in a romance novel. It's like there'd be some sort of cognitive dissonance there. The reality is that, after I read the book, one of the thoughts that came to mind was, this could be a movie that helps people no longer ask the question, why did she say?
Hey, besties. So, Blake Lively, champion of women, protector of the sisterhood, our self-appointed guardian against the big bad world, cares deeply about us. She cares about what we go through, the fear, the harm, the constant reminder that it's not always a safe place out there for women. She cares so much, in fact, that she decided to file a lawsuit. For us. Yes, really. Blake's lawsuit, she says, isn't just about her. It's about women everywhere. Because when Blake sues, she sues for justice. Or, for publicity, Unsealed too. And it's way juicier. Blake says this lawsuit is all about standing up for women on set, fighting against the egregious conduct she allegedly witnessed or endured. Sounds noble, right? Except none of the damages she's actually seeking have anything to do with that. Instead, she's demanding a jaw-dropping $650 million. Yes, you heard that right. All for reputational damage. She claims the fallout tanked her sparkling beverage brand, wrecked her hair care line, and cost her both acting and producing gigs. It's less not me too moment and more to pay me too much. Because the numbers here, absolutely bananas. And while those filings were just made public, what got unsealed next might be even more revealing. Not about what happened on set, but what happened after. Who are abusers and then turning their trauma into merch. And that, besties, is where this whole mess really began. See, Colleen Hoover, yes, the author of It Ends With Us, became ground zero for the backlash long before cameras even started rolling. Fans were furious. They called the coloring book tone-deaf, exploitative, and downright bizarre. I mean, imagine sitting down to color in scenes inspired by domestic violence. It's not exactly self-care Sunday material. But Hoover didn't stop there. There was nail polish, merch, tie-ins that made people ask, is this about healing or is this about sales? So, by the time Blake and Justin Baldoni walked onto that set, the internet already had its pitchforks out. And the texts that just got unsealed? They show exactly how that tension bled into production. Cast members whispering about PR strategies, concerns about optics, and Blake herself allegedly pushing to reshape the film's image to distance it from the controversy surrounding Hoover. So, while Blake's lawsuit paints her as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, these messages suggest the real drama started long before the press tours. And it had everything to do with the source material itself. Love at that age. Probably not much, right? That's what made Colleen Hoover's writing so controversial. She wasn't just selling fiction, she was shaping perception. Her stories wrapped toxic relationships in glossy covers and poetic dialogue, making abuse look complicated, tragic, even romantic. Critics pointed out that her heroines rarely stand on their own. They're fragile, codependent, constantly drawn back to the men who hurt them. The message, intentional or not, seeps through. Pain is passion, and red flags are just misunderstood love stories. And here's the kicker. These books weren't tucked away in an adult section. They were marketed directly to young women, teens even, 18 to 25-year-olds who were still figuring out what healthy boundaries look like, who maybe didn't yet know how manipulation disguises itself as affection. So when you hand that audience a story like It Ends With Us, and then turn it into a movie, merch line, and yes, a coloring book, you're not just telling a story, you're teaching a generation what love is supposed to look like. And that's where so many people said, enough, police? But context matters, especially when you're dealing with trauma narratives being packaged as romance. And that's what made It Ends With Us such a lightning rod. It wasn't just the book's content, it was the way it was sold. The pastel covers, the dreamy quotes, the TikTok edits, all of it framed the story like a love fantasy, not a cautionary tale. So when Colleen Hoover and the studio brought Blake Lively on board, it was supposed to add prestige, to legitimize the project. Look, it's not exploitation, it's empowerment. But that backfired instantly. The public didn't see Blake as reclaiming the story. They saw her profiting off the same glamorized pain they were already protesting. And when Blake started reshaping the film's promotional tone, softer lighting, fashion-forward styling, high-end brand tie-ins. It only fueled the perception that the message had been lost entirely. What was meant to be a story about breaking cycles now looked like it was celebrating them. Would you like me to continue from here with the section about how this growing backlash turned into full-blown PR chaos once the behind-the-scenes messages leaked? These interviews were heavily scripted, like down to the exact phrasing. The unsealed messages show PR handlers feeding him lines word for word, coaching tone, and even instructing him which emotions to project on camera. It wasn't organic. It was manufactured damage control. And the reason that matters is because it directly ties to Blake's claims. In these same exchanges, Justin allegedly expressed frustration about how the narrative was being shaped, how Blake's team was redirecting press attention away from the film's controversies and toward her empowerment journey. He, Chivis, apparently called it reputation laundering through trauma and said he didn't want to babysit a brand in crisis. Now, those are his words, but they hit hard in context. Because if Blake's entire lawsuit hinges on reputational harm, on the idea that her image was unfairly tarnished, then these behind-the-scenes communications show how much of that image was already being artificially controlled. It blurs the line between real damage and self-inflicted PR collapse.abuse, and you can literally see the shift. He pauses, looks slightly off camera, and then gives an answer that sounds like it came straight out of a crisis management playbook. He says, "I think it's important that we don't conflate storytelling with glorification. This is about starting conversations, not romanticizing pain." Word for word, that's the same line that appeared in the leaked PR notes written by Jenel 2 days earlier. She had written, "Frame the film as a conversation starter. Emphasize awareness, not romance. Avoid defensive tone." And Justin repeated it verbatim. The emails even show her reminding him before the interview. If she presses on DV, pivot to empathy, not guilt. We're not owning the narrative, we're reframing it. Now, that might sound like standard PR prep, but here's where it gets murky. In the same batch of unsealed messages, Blake herself was reportedly micromanaging the phrasing of these talking points, inserting her own edits about how she wanted the story told. She wrote, "Make sure Justin reminds them that we made this film to empower women." That's the pull quote I want everywhere. It paints a very different picture, one where the empowerment message wasn't organic or heartfelt, but carefully engineered as a shield against criticism. Want me to continue with how that AP interview went viral and people started comparing the scripted lines to the leaked PR notes? So here's where it all blew up. During that same press junket, Justin was asked point blank by a reporter, "What do you say to critics who think It Ends With Us glorifies domestic violence?" His answer, calm, deliberate, clearly rehearsed, became the soundbite heard everywhere. Within hours, outlets like Glamour and E! News blasted headlines across social media. Justin Baldoni responds to claims that It Ends With Us glorifies domestic violence. Each article cited his quote, tying it directly to the wave of criticism Colleen Hoover had already been facing. News even ran with, Justin Baldoni addresses accusations that It Ends With Us romanticizes abuse. And that's when everything took a turn behind the scenes. According to the unsealed text messages, Colleen was furious. The phrasing of Justin's response, the exact same conversation starter line from Jenel's PR memo, apparently rubbed her the wrong way. She thought it threw her under the bus, reinforcing the narrative that she was to blame for the backlash. In one message, she allegedly wrote, "Why is he apologizing for my story? It makes me look guilty of something I didn't do." So, the tension didn't start on the red carpet. It started in the press junket room with a single, scripted answer that sparked a PR Cold War between the film's director and its author.
If anybody has had that real-life experience, can imagine how hard it would be to imagine their experience being in a romance novel. It's like there'd be some sort of cognitive dissonance there. And so I understand any survivor or person who has that thought by looking at as you say, like the one-liner. And then to them, I would just offer that we were very intentional in the making of this movie.
Romance, pink tones, soft lighting, floral covers, all the visual cues of a love story. But the actual story wasn't a romance. It was about a cycle of abuse. So when the promotional material came out, audiences felt blindsided. Viewers said it made light of trauma, turning something deeply painful into something aesthetic and palatable. By the time the film's trailer dropped, that criticism had already reached a boiling point. TikTok threads were dissecting every frame. People were stitching reactions, calling it tone deaf, and advocacy groups were questioning how a story about domestic violence could be packaged like a Valentine's Day release. The backlash wasn't just literary anymore, it was cultural. And here's where it all started to unravel for Blake Lively. Because instead of addressing the conversation about tone and representation, her team, and reportedly Blake herself, doubled down on the romantic marketing. Pink posters, heart emojis. It's a love story, captions. It looked like a complete dismissal of the very harm the source material had been criticized for. Already this huge divide forming between fans who saw It Ends With Us as a powerful story about survival and critics who saw it as romanticized trauma wrapped in pastel packaging. By the time production began, that tension had built into a full-blown cultural debate. Book Talk was split. One side defended Hoover, saying she was starting a conversation. The other side said she was selling pain as aesthetic, pink bruises, and poetic heartbreak. And when Blake Lively signed on to star and produce, she stepped right into the center of that storm because Blake wasn't just the actress, she became the face of the adaptation. Her image was tied to the marketing, her lifestyle brand aesthetic seeped into the visuals, and suddenly what was supposed to be a story about escaping abuse looked like another glossy romance. That tone clash reignited all the old criticisms, that the project was out of touch, that it commodified trauma, that the team didn't understand the gravity of the story they were selling, guided by love and integrity through every step of this process. I care deeply about this story and about you. That message, meant to smooth things over, was a classic PR patch. Warm, neutral, and non-combative. But behind the scenes, it showed the chaos brewing inside the It Ends With Us team. Colleen Hoover, the author, was furious that Justin's public comments seemed to distance himself from the very tone she'd approved. Justin, meanwhile, was caught between defending the film's moral framing and protecting his working relationship with its creator. What's important here is that this moment, the Associated Press interview, was the spark that ignited the entire internal meltdown. It exposed how fractured the project had become. Blake and her PR camp wanted control of the narrative. Justin was trying to navigate authenticity and brand safety. And Colleen, whose name built the franchise, suddenly felt like the outsider to her own story. Should be asking why the men are abusing. He used his platform to highlight empathy and accountability, something that, on paper, should have aligned perfectly with the film's supposed message. But behind closed doors, that compassionate tone created a fracture. Colleen Hoover, according to the newly unsealed texts, felt that Justin's statements were misrepresenting the story, that by leaning so heavily into advocacy and awareness, he was making the book and film look like a PSA rather than a love story. Her team worried it would alienate fans who came for romance, not reality. And that's where the tension really exploded. Justin wanted to use the moment to help survivors, while Colleen and, reportedly, Blake's camp wanted to protect the brand, to steer away from controversy, not lean into it. What was meant to be a heartfelt press tour started looking like a moral tug-of-war between message and marketing, empathy and image control. Words and behavior had already shown. But here's the kicker. Those clips weren't deepfakes, they weren't doctored. They were just receipts. Industry panels where she interrupted people mid-sentence, behind-the-scenes footage where she snapped at crew, interviews where she shaded co-stars. These weren't smear campaign assets, as her lawsuit frames them. They were déjà vu for Hollywood insiders who'd seen this pattern before. So when the public started connecting the dots, that Justin Baldoni, the so-called sensitive male lead, was being sidelined, and Blake Lively was seemingly controlling the narrative. It didn't take long for the internet to turn on her. The hashtags began trending. TikToks dissected her tone. Reddit threads resurfaced stories from Savage's Rhythm section and A Simple Favor. It wasn't a coordinated takedown, it was a reckoning. And now, in her lawsuit, Blake is trying to repackage that reckoning as defamation. She's arguing that public accountability, people reposting or reacting to her documented behavior, constitutes a malicious reputation attack. But courts don't see truth as defamation, and that's what's making her case crumble piece by piece. $1 million for reputational damage. especially when most of that damage stems from her own choices, behavior, and words. The court doesn't compensate for self-inflicted wounds, and that's exactly what this looks like. Even worse, many of her projected numbers rely on fantasy math. She's taking theoretical best-case future profits from brands that weren't even publicly launched, multiplying them by speculative growth rates, then claiming that as loss. That's not evidence, that's a pitch deck. And the irony is, the judge already noted that the harm she's describing isn't emotional distress or workplace retaliation. It's reputational. That puts her case squarely in defamation territory. And defamation cases require proof of lies, not just negative coverage. The problem? The defamatory statements she's suing over are mostly her own interviews, press clips, and footage of her on set. You can't sue someone for reposting your own behavior. The legal term for that is truth is an absolute defense. So what we're watching unfold here is a masterclass in Hollywood delusion, a lawsuit built not on law, but on vanity and denial. She's trying to sue her way out of public accountability, claiming her career tanked because of others, when in reality, her own conduct has been the most consistent PR disaster. Look, claiming $650 million because you might never work again is laughable. Blake hasn't stopped working. She starred in another Simple Favor, she's already signed on to a new film, she's been actively promoting her hair care and beverage lines, and she just got a Time Honor. That doesn't look like someone who's been permanently sidelined. A big red flag. She's treating 65 million impressions of alleged defamatory statements like a dollar sign on a balance sheet. That's not how defamation damages are calculated. You don't get to multiply impressions into a windfall. Courts want concrete proof. Lost contracts, canceled deals, signed offers that were ripped away. Speculation and fantasy forecasts don't cut it. Worse, she's mixing personal losses with corporate projections for companies that aren't even parties to this suit. Blake Brown Beauty, Betty Buzz, and claiming those companies' hypothetical profits as her own. You can't recover corporate losses personally unless you pierce the corporate veil. And courts hate double recovery. You can't be paid twice for the same alleged harm. Then there's the math behind punitive damages. They aren't an automatic triple your damages cookie. Punitive amounts are tethered to what's proven and what a state's law allows, not to entrepreneurial daydreams. On top of all this, her numbers are built on expert testimony she'll have to pay for, meaning she's already burning legal dollars on speculative models that may never survive scrutiny. She also has an obligation to mitigate. If Blake truly feared she'd never work again, she'd be out doing appearances, promoting products, taking reasonable steps to repair her brand. You can't claim huge future losses while also sitting on your hands. The law requires you to try to limit the damage. Bottom line, this looks like a fantasy damages schedule, a stack of optimistic projections and corporate valuations patched together to justify an eye-popping figure. The judge is already treating her claims as reputational, not workplace harm, and that makes these mega damage claims especially vulnerable. If I had to bet, the experts, the double counting, the corporate versus person mess, that's what's going to blow this apart on summary judgment. Remember, this entire case was supposed to be about sexual harassment, about standing up for women. Yet somehow, Blake's argument has drifted entirely into reputational harm. She's claiming that what happened was so devastating to her public image that she'll never be able to work again. Not because she's unsafe, not because she's traumatized, but because people on the internet don't like her anymore. Lately, her filings have gotten even messier. She's telling the court she can't prove the alleged smear campaign because the Signal chats were deleted. She can't prove harassment tied to the so-called birth video because, conveniently, she never received the version she wanted or doesn't remember seeing it. And now she's asking the judge to ban the defense from even saying there was no smear campaign. Why? Because her entire case hinges on reputation. If those reputational